The nucleoside innovation for which the Nobel Prize here was given was the conversion of the uracil, that is the natural nucleoside in mRNA, to something called pseudouridine. Now, pseudouridine is something that is chemically sufficiently similar that it fits in an mRNA chain the same way that a uracil would, and it allows the translation by the ribosome to occur. But what it does is it interrupts the body's natural tendency to break down the mRNAs. So imagine that your body produces a lot of mRNAs that produce proteins, but those mRNAs are constantly being taken apart. And so the way the body regulates whether or not you're producing proteins or not is whether it introduces new mRNAs, the old ones having been broken down. So by introducing, the weird caveat here is that pseudouridine is actually something that nature does occasionally introduce into mRNAs, but it does it very sparsely. That is to say, if nature decides that a particular mRNA would be better off in a more stable form, it may introduce a pseudouridine, but it doesn't do it across every uracil in the message. So what these folks have done is they have introduced a whole slew of pseudouridines, making the mRNA transcript extremely durable.
Just a question.
Yep.
You said a whole slew, so not all the uracils?
I believe it's all.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Now, there's also a question about manufacturing and technique and how effective.
But the intention is all. It's not, a whole slew sounds like there's a lot more than one. But if it's uracil is replaced with pseudouridine, that's a different kind of situation.
Right. Now, a couple of interesting points. One, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And by them, I do not only mean these now Nobel laureates, but those involved in the program to produce these vaccines who did not initially know whether or not they would be successful at producing enough protein to induce an immune response. They might have thought, well, one of the challenges is that the mRNA is going to be rapidly broken down, and that may mean that even though we have introduced something that might technically be able to produce an immune response, it won't be around long enough to succeed at it. So they may have turned up the dial on stabilizing the mRNA, thinking that that was necessary to get any effect at all. That said, what they did was absolutely reckless, especially in an environment in which the testing was extremely truncated. So they've stabilized the mRNAs to a degree that they cannot say in advance. They've done it in a way that is most unnatural, and now they've been given a prize for that stabilization, which the Nobel Committee, in awarding the prize, says was essential to producing a viable vaccine. Now, that's not true. And I would ask people to go look at Chris Martinson's analysis of this. But Chris Martinson points out that there are versions of the vaccine, even mRNA-based versions of the vaccine, that were not pseudouridine stabilized and were initially tested and did produce a detectable antibody response, which means that the choice to do this was not inherently necessary. It's possible that a version of the vaccines which had not been pseudouridine stabilized might have worked, but we never got a chance to find out. All right. So with that as background, I now want to look at these two pieces of video. The first one from the Nobel Committee itself, which held a miniature press conference. And the first thing you're going to hear is a Chinese journalist in English asking a question about the long-term safety of these vaccines. And then you will hear the answer as delivered by the committee. Go ahead and show that.
Hello, this is Caixin Media from China, and with the mRNA, we don't know the long-term effect yet. So do you have any concern over that?
Richard, would you like to respond to that question?
Yes. Of course, mRNA vaccines have only been given for a certain amount of time, which begs your question. Having said that, of course, the mRNA vaccine that is given is very transient, and the fact that 13 billion people have gotten the virus, vaccine virus, and I mean, the amount of side effects noted to date is extremely limited. So I don't think it's a major concern.
Anyone else want to add to that, or that's fine, I guess? I think that's... Ulle?
Well, it can't be integrated into the nucleus, into the DNA, and that's, a safety precaution. The adverse effects that's been noted is mostly a mild myocarditis or perimyocarditis, mainly affecting young males, but that normally resolves without any long-term effects.
Okay, now, I find this piece of video shocking because nobody who is familiar with the actual vaccine technology and the evidence that has emerged could possibly deliver this answer in good faith. This answer is too far from reality to be believed. And yet these people appear earnest in delivering it. They do not appear to be knowingly lying, and yet they essentially have to be. Now notice that the first thing that the person identified as Ricard says is that we don't have to worry about the long-term hazard of the mRNA vaccines because their presence is transient. Now, notice this exact committee has just given the most coveted scientific prize there is for specifically the innovation of making the mRNA less transient.
Precisely.
They have given it for this thing, and yet he says transient as if he is not just calling into question the wisdom of this committee that has awarded a prize for making it less transient. Now, how not transient is it? Let's talk about specifically the mRNAs. The answer is we don't know how not transient it is. What we do know is that it has been found 2 months after inoculation. It's not that it stopped being findable after 2 months. We stopped looking after 2 months. We know that it persists for 2 months, and then how long after that, we cannot say. That is anything but transient. It is preternatural, does not begin to describe the way this mRNA behaves. In fact, when I spoke to Robert Malone about it, I used the analogy that this was like a fiberglass log in a zoo exhibit, right? It looks like a log, but it's not being broken down by termites and fungi because it's made of fiberglass. This is a permanent feature of the environment.
But it's even worse
Even worse than that, yeah.
right? As you well know, which is that it's not just a static permanent feature of we don't know permanent, but it's not just a static, very long-lived feature of your body now. It is a factory. It has the instructions to make in this case, the spike protein. And so presumably will continue to do so long as it exists. So it's not just floating about, ready to be disassembled by your immune system as the effects, the product of a normal vaccine, of a traditional vaccine would be. It is a factory for the production of the antigen that you are trying to get immune response for, or against, that is itself been stabilized so that it can attain a less transient state.
Yep. Okay. Ricard also says that the side effects to date are limited. What? Actually, the side effects, the severe ones, are off the charts in every place that we have monitored. Now, the only place that you can claim that that's not true are places where we haven't looked. But in the VAERS system, the yellow card system, the military system, we see an off-the-charts adverse event signal. What's more, when this has been looked at carefully in a scientifically rigorous way, we have seen evidence of an off-the-chart signal even in the clinical trial data. So there's a paper which we will link to the description of this video First author is Joe Freeman. Peter Doshi is the last author, that looked at the clinical trials and found something like a 1 in 800 incidence of a severe adverse effect. So that is not a minor level. And what's more, that measurement, 1 in 800 severe adverse reactions in the clinical trials, is the tip of the iceberg inherently, because it was measured over such a short period of time. That is to say, anything that happened months down the road from vaccination was not captured in that. In fact, Pfizer's data only goes 1 month. So in 1 month, they saw a 1 in 800 level of severe adverse events. That's not rare, and we are not talking about minor adverse events either. And then the next gentleman says that mostly what we see is myocarditis. He is, for some reason, he says, well, but that's mostly in young males. I don't know why anybody is supposed to be comforted by that. But he says mostly myocarditis, mostly in young males, and mostly it resolves without any long-term effect, which is nonsense. Myocarditis is an inherently serious condition. We see a very powerful signal that looks strongly associated with vaccinations, with these vaccinations, of all-cause mortality that does not begin with the onset of COVID, but does begin with the onset of the vaccination campaign. So there's every reason to think that this isn't true, that it's not limited to myocarditis, and that the rate is very high and serious, and some of these things are life-shortening.
In fact, one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit later, but I think we can go there now, is this published in Nature this last week, COVID vaccines linked to unexpected vaginal bleeding. A large cohort study measured how frequently women reported bleeding after receiving COVID-19 jabs. And I was going to bring this up on the last show because this is relevant to the lambasting of Naomi Wolf by the mainstream media, including by Naomi Klein in her new book Doppelganger, because Wolf was one of the people who was saying this over and over and over again and got, roundly mocked and demonetized and deplatformed and all of these things for saying this. And now that it's in Nature, we're allowed to talk about it, but we are being assured, nevertheless, that they are safe and effective. And the link in the piece in Nature as to their safety and effectiveness is to this article, which you can now show, Zach, from February 2021. Their evidence in an article published now from a cohort study now demonstrating that actually the people like Naomi Wolf who were yelling from the rooftops about menstrual effects in women who were getting these shots, our assurances that these are safe and effective goes back to February 2021, COVID vaccines and safety, what the research says. COVID vaccines and safety, what the research says. As the vaccines are rolled out, researchers learning about the extent and nature of side effects. They assure us that it's basically fine. Again, this is proof now that these vaccines are safe and effective from February 2021. But even so, they acknowledge that there are side effects. I got the vaccine. 6 hours later, I had chills and high fever, muscle aches. I went to bed for 24 hours. So you had a thing to say here.
Yeah, I was going to say that this, in the large quiver of tricks that pharma plays, this idea of looking way back into the early days in order to figure out whether something is safe and effective is clearly used again and again. And it's used, in fact, in the trials themselves. So one of the things that happens is in these trials, there is an ethical requirement that if a drug is so good, it is demonstrated to be so good in the process of the clinical trial that it would be unethical not to give it to everybody, then you unblind the trial, effectively ending it, making it impossible to find long-term effects. So pharma targets this. And in fact, if you couple this with what we've covered here before, the Norman Fenton and Martin McNeil piece, the so-called cheap trick, where they create the impression of efficacy by using a cutoff date of 2 weeks, and they classify everybody who gets sick in those 2 weeks as unvaccinated, thereby generating, I think it was 83+% impression of efficacy just simply through shifting categories, having nothing to do with the effect of the drug in question.
So Fenton and McNeil, just to remind everyone, are uncovering the statistical trick by which anything could be demonstrated in quotes, to be effective simply by categorizing things in the way that these results have been categorized.
Yep. I am experiencing a bit of terror. It's McNeil, not Neil. Did I mess it up? Have I added a syllable to his name in any way? In any case, maybe you could figure that out. Okay. But let's continue. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, in the middle of talking about the awarding of the Nobel in Physiology and Medicine to the two people who have invented, I think, rather than discovered in this case. And of course, the award could be given for either invention or discovery. But the invention of a way to make less transient and more stable the mRNA that is used in the mRNA platform that is being given in these so-called vaccines. We are talking about, seeing the committee saying, oh, the effects, any side effects are going to be transient because the vaccines themselves are transient, when in fact the award has been given precisely for the trick, for the scientific trick, the impressive, if not necessarily safe scientific trick of replacing uracil with pseudouridine and thus making the entire object more likely to stick around in the body. We see new evidence of even Nature saying, there's work out now that says, yeah, all those women who were saying they were experiencing weird menstrual effects were actually right, but nothing to see here, folks. They're still safe and effective. Here, check out this thing that we wrote back in February 2021. And just one more link in that chain before we go back to the Nobel story. As long as we're digging deep in the Nature archives, which we didn't want to do, it was Nature that is citing their own archives pretty deep from 2.5 years ago as evidence that these vaccines are safe and effective. They have, in that same safe and effective article from February 2021, a related article called How COVID Unlocked the Power of RNA. And this is from January 2021. So we are going way back in time, right? This is, remember, the first people were getting their vaccinations, and this was mostly medical providers in December 2020. So in January 2021, there are not that many people who have, and at that point, many people are clamoring for these things, that people are trying to get vaccinated, but they're just, it's the rollout is careful. It's fast, but what we are told is there's not enough, right? And this, of course, increases demand because people want something that's in short supply. But in the middle of that, we have How COVID Unlocked the Power of RNA, published in Nature, January 2021. Let me just read a couple of sections from this article. 5 years and one global pandemic later, RNA vaccines are proving their worth. Last month, 2 RNA vaccine candidates, one from U.S. pharmaceutical giant Pfizer and BioNTech in Mainz, Germany, and another from Moderna in Cambridge, Massachusetts, won emergency approval from regulators in several countries to fight COVID-19. Remember when that was new, right? So go down in this article a little bit more. Side effects can be troubling. The RNA technology has proved itself, but it's not done yet, says Philip Dormitzer, head of viral vaccines research at Pfizer and a former colleague of Giel's at Novartis. And now that we've seen it work for COVID-19, it's tempting to want to do more. And I think I have one more little section, stability and safety. Despite its many potential advantages, today's RNA vaccine technology leaves room for improvement. This technology is still super early, says Robin Shattuck, an immunologist at Imperial College London, and we're going to see multiple generations and iterations over the coming years, I suspect. And then we have 3 examples of the potential problems with this vaccine. Again, first, there's the issue of cold storage. There's another challenge. So far, RNA vaccines tested for human use against disease, COVID-19 or otherwise, have generally required a double dose to be effective. And judging by poor compliance with other multi-dose vaccines, many people who get the first shot probably won't get the second. Well, that didn't turn out to be the case by and large, although some people stopped at 1. New delivery systems could fix that. At Vaccess Technologies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example, researchers have developed a wearable skin patch studded with tiny silk-tipped dissolvable microneedles that slowly trickle vaccine into the body.
Oh.
And finally, administering the vaccine in drips instead of all at once could help to solve a third drawback: side effects. Severe reactions, although transient, do seem to be more common with COVID-19 shots than with other immunizations. More than 80% of people who received the Moderna vaccine in clinical trials had some type of systemic reaction to the shot, with bouts of fatigue, muscle pain, and other issues that often proved briefly debilitating. I share that to remind us and to alert those who weren't aware that back in January of 2021, even Nature was pointing out that one of the problems with this platform that the entire world is being encouraged, nay, in some cases mandated to get, was severe side effects so much more widespread and also severe in individuals than other vaccines had, that it was worth mentioning as a possible reason that maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all.
Well, but they're allowed to say stuff like that. We are heretics if we say things like that.
Right.
So, you have to check your privilege. And by doing that, that means you've got to check which privileges you are allowed based on your position in the universe.
Right.
All right. So I wanted to cover one more thing from that video before we move on to the next one.
Okay.
He makes the claim, the second speaker makes the claim that the mRNA is not integrated into the nuclear DNA, and therefore that is another reason to imagine that long-term effects are not a problem. Now, this may technically be right, but it ought to be no comfort based on what we now understand. And mind you, this is a modern video, so he has every reason to understand everything that you and I understand. Whether or not the message in the mRNA finds its way into the nucleus and is ever integrated into the nuclear genome of your cells, something else does appear to be making its way into the nucleus from these vaccines. Mm-hmm. And this is a mind-blowing story, which we have yet to cover in detail. But this is largely the work of Kevin McKernan and an anonymous account, JikiLeaks, on Twitter. And I would say it is clear that McKernan has unearthed a tremendous amount of DNA contamination in the vials. This is work done where somebody, one of the people who was involved in the vaccination campaign, saved every vial, and that left a residual that could be tested for its contents. So this is a fairly large sample of vials, and what McKernan unearthed was a huge amount of DNA contamination. What the hell is DNA doing in there at all? And the story behind this is mind-blowing, and it will have a resonance to something that you were talking about a couple weeks ago. The explanation for this DNA is that there were apparently two mechanisms for generating the contents, the active contents of these vaccines, the mRNA transcripts. The first one was used for the clinical trials. It was not sufficiently productive to be able to scale it up to vaccinate billions of people. So a second mechanism for generating these transcripts was utilized that involved plasmids in bacteria. So in other words, they involved DNA in the production of these mRNA transcripts, and they did not purify the stuff out. The stuff is there in huge quantities. What did they do? They broke it up. They used restriction enzymes to break up these DNA fragments. So what you effectively have is a chaos of different length pieces of DNA that do appear to be integrating into the nuclear genome. Now this is a disaster because there's all sorts of stuff in there, like
a great set of evolutionary opportunities for that DNA potentially.
It's at the very least like broadcasting a powerful mutagenic signal arbitrarily into the tissues of the body. And I would point out...
Why that phrasing? Broadcasting a mutagenic signal into the tissues of the body.
Let's imagine that the chopping up of this DNA effectively produces a random distribution of lengths, or a bell curve. You're going to have some intermediate and then some very long fragments, some very short fragments. Okay, but some chaotic assortment. And then those things are going to integrate based on idiosyncrasies of the nuclear genome, what has an affinity for a particular piece that causes that piece to stick there and then insert itself. Now, the problem here is that you are introducing stuff that is not biologically inert inherently. some of these fragments are going to be so short that they can't really encode anything important. The most they can do is disrupt something important, which can be catastrophic. But some other things, like there's a simian virus 40 promoter that McKernan has found that could actually take stuff that's supposed to be inactive in the genome and turn it on. Now, the question is, what might this, for example, have to do? This whole story is so crazy. The turbo cancers. Remember turbo cancers, how people were reporting, oh my God, you're seeing people who've been in remission for a long period of time who suddenly have rapid growth of their tumor, or people who were free from tumors who suddenly are diagnosed with them. This is a pattern I first learned about from Ryan Cole, a pathologist who noticed this in all of the samples coming across his desk. Now remember, a pathologist is a unique kind of doctor because he's not seeing tons of patients, which limits the number of people he can see. What he's seeing is huge numbers of samples from all sorts of doctors who are sending him stuff and saying, what is this? So he was in a position to see much more broadly than other people, and he was bold enough to say what he was seeing, and he was talking about the cancers he was seeing very, very early on. And the reason I raise him specifically at this moment, not only is this potentially relevant to the integration of random DNA fragments from these vaccines, but Ryan Cole is currently fighting to preserve his license. He is literally facing a, I don't know what the right term is,
Tribunal.
but a tribunal evaluating whether or not he can continue to practice medicine, which is absurd. Ryan Cole has been ahead again and again and again on this topic, and he's being punished for it, and this is happening right here in the West.
Right. No, that's terrifying. What do we know about what conditions are necessary and sufficient, if we know that much, for chopped up pieces of DNA that are floating about to integrate with your own?
I don't think, let's put it this way. I'm no expert. My guess is that because what you have is an elaborate set of machinery in the cell designed to do all kinds of things, like repair broken DNA. So if you dump a bunch of broken DNA into the cell that the cell is not expecting, it may respond by going into repair mode, and that may end up integrating things that you wouldn't want to integrate. So I would say, look.
Okay, so maybe nothing extraordinary is required at all, maybe.
I think nothing extraordinary is required. Why nothing extraordinary is required is a story others would be better positioned to explain. But let's just put it this way. It is reckless to be dumping a chaotic assortment of DNA fragments into a human being because, you know, it's a welcome to complex systems moment. What's going to happen if you do that? Well, the answer is almost anything can happen, but high on the list of things you would expect would be cancers. Why? Well, this goes back to my work, actually. The idea that we are riddled with what I called prototumors, which are would-be tumors that have been arrested as they've run out of the capacity to duplicate. Those are tumors, except that they don't have telomerase turned on. You know, could random fragments introduced into the genome activate telomerase, and for which every cell in your body has the code?
Right.
It could. So I don't know how all these things fit together, but it's like, of all the reckless things you could do, dumping a bunch of random fragments of information into an information system like this on which your health depends couldn't be crazier. But the link to what you were presenting a couple weeks ago is they ran the clinical trials with the vaccines produced under Procedure 1.
Oh, right.
And then they switched to Procedure 2 to scale it up, thereby not providing any information on the actual hazard of vaccines produced by Technique 2, when they very well could have used Technique 2 for the stuff that they tested in the clinical trials.
So the different method may very well have, and there's no reason to think it didn't, have created a different product. And therefore, having tested product 1, but bringing product 2 to market means that the product that is on market has not been tested.
Yes, exactly. Has not been tested. And this would, you know, a witting pharma attempting to obscure hazards from their, let's face it, utterly crappy production mechanism that is utterly riddled with not just the design defects in the vaccine itself, but the impurities that come from lousy quality control, right? Of course, in order to hide those things, it would do this. It would have some very careful, it's like giving the reviewer of an automobile a version that was specifically tailored to make them happy rather than reflect what the consumer is going to see, right? It's sleight of hand. Okay, before we go to the second piece of video, I know this is taking a long time, but before we go to the, I want to highlight one other odd fact of this award having been given for this narrow piece of the mRNA vaccine technology. Not only does that effectively admit what Robert Malone has been saying and what Alexandros Marinos validated, that he is the inventor of the mRNA vaccine technology, long since out of patent, but
I don't think that this award demonstrates that.
it admits it tacitly because what they're trying to do is validate the vaccines, and they've given the award for a narrow piece of technology.
That is an interpretation. I do not think that that is the only interpretation.
I can't find another one that would make sense other than they don't want to validate Malone because Malone has some things to say about how this technology has been utilized. But anyway, we can leave that aside. Nonetheless, the pseudouridine stabilization of these vaccines, of the mRNAs in these vaccines, is, I think, the greatest design defect on a long list of design defects in these vaccines. Now, I said that to Robert Malone the day the award was given, and he said, no, he thinks the spike protein, the choice of spike protein, is the greatest design defect. But let's just say that there's a debate to be had between those. The spike protein is cytotoxic, as we were famously fact-checked for pointing out on DarkHorse. But anyway, it is cytotoxic.
It is.
But the mRNA transcript means that it is produced far longer in the body. So I guess there's a debate to be had about which of these things is dumber. But they're both pretty dumb, and one of them just got a Nobel Prize. So that's a fascinating fact, right? This Nobel Prize was literally given for a design defect of the vaccines, not arguably one of their strengths. All right, so let's go to this next piece of video. This is a podcast from January 2021.
So that same moment that Nature was describing the many side effects that the mRNA platform brings.
Right. And the guest on this podcast is Drew Weissman, who just won the Nobel Prize for this pseudouridine.
Who at that point was still 2.5 years from winning the Nobel Prize.
Right. I will say I'm going to criticize many of the things he says, but let us remember that some of these criticisms have to be tempered by the fact that we hadn't yet vaccinated billions of people, and therefore the amount of information about the actual consequence of that was much less.
How can we be sure that this vaccine will not cause long-term negative impact in humans? Like, that's one of our big questions that we hear a lot.
So, I mean, the first is to understand what the vaccine is. The mRNA in the vaccine is identical to the RNA in your cells. So the RNA in your cells isn't causing long-term adverse events. So the RNA in the vaccine won't either. The RNA is degraded probably within a week. It's completely gone. The lipid nanoparticles contain 4 types of fat. 2 of the fats are identical to what's in our cells. They're physiologic. The other 2 are present at incredibly low levels. They are gone within 24 to 48 hours. They're just, the body degrades them. They're gone. So nothing of the vaccine is left after days to a week or so. The question becomes, well, then how do you get a long-term adverse event? Well, you can't from any components of the vaccine because they're gone. The mRNA does not integrate into the DNA. It doesn't affect the DNA. It doesn't.
All right. So there are a number of things to point out here. The biggest error that he makes right up front. He says that the mRNA is identical to the mRNA in your cells. And from this, he derives a tremendous amount of comfort. His point is essentially, look, this is in you already. How could introducing a little more of it possibly hurt you? And this is the biggest piece of garbage one can imagine. For one thing, this is the guy whose invention is making this a very unnatural thing for which there is no natural analog in your body.
So put aside what his actual invention was for a moment, which makes what he said just patently not true, and he knows it. Even if it were true, mRNA is built of certain things. And even if the mRNA that was in his invention was built of exactly the same things, which it de facto cannot be because the whole point is that he's using something new, but even if it were, the fact that it uses the same materials but has instructions to make a particular protein is the point. So the idea, we don't have in us the instruction set to produce the spike protein. We don't. You and I don't. Many people do now, right? If they receive these vaccines. So the grotesque, obvious error there is, no, but dude, you literally did the thing that changes the mRNA such that it's less transient, such that it's more stable, such that it stays in the body for longer. And that's not what we have in our bodies already. But even if that weren't true, the whole point is that it is an instruction set. It's a factory for creating something in particular, which in this case, they chose the spike protein. Oopsie.
Right. So this is crazy at 3 levels.
3. Okay.
Yeah. The first level is the mRNA itself isn't like a natural mRNA because you altered it, dude. Right? So that's 1. 2 is that it is informationally novel, and it is therefore causing your body to produce something that is not naturally in it. And so the thing that is produced could be good, could be bad, but it ain't just your stuff. So the whole argument that you're doing this anyway, this doesn't change anything, is like an argument designed to fool people who don't know anything. And then the third thing, so we've got the modification you made makes the mRNA itself not natural. And it's not the only way it's not natural either, by the way. This mRNA was codon optimized for the human environment. It has had modifications to the spike protein sequence for various functional reasons. But the point is, this just is not natural. The informational content produces something which could be a toxin, it could be a substitute for something that you should be producing but don't. But the point is, it's saying that, that thing is not dangerous because it's made of the same materials in your toaster. Yes, but it's a firearm, right? Yeah, but it's made of the same stuff in your toaster. And you're not arguing that, toasters are deadly, are you? Right? So it's like that kind of argument.
Okay, so that's 1 and 2.
Yeah. And then the third one is, if you produce a protein that you were not producing early in your development, it is a signal to your immune system to attack your cells. It tells your immune system that your cells have been infected by a virus, and the correct response to that is to destroy your own tissue. So even if the protein itself that was encoded by the mRNA was itself inert, the fact that it is novel to your body means that it will trigger your body to do damage to itself. So that's 3 different ways this is nonsense.
Well, the trigger your body to do damage to itself is the same trick as in traditional vaccines, right? I'm going to introduce an antigen that can hopefully get your immune system's attention quickly and efficiently and cause it to recognize, kill, and remember. So that is the basis on which traditional vaccines function.
Well, yes and no. There are various traditional vaccines. There's one traditional platform, and it's actually the one that I would say is the safest, that uses this trick, but in a very different way.
Yes.
An attenuated virus does cause some of your tissues to produce a foreign protein that will get them attacked. And I believe this is a point that I believe has only been made here on DarkHorse. The lipid nanoparticle encoding an mRNA message is effectively a pseudovirus. An actual virus that has been attenuated has an ecology It has a mechanism of action that will inherently limit what tissues it invades.
Yes.
The next thing that this guy, this now Nobel laureate, goes on to talk about is the fats that are used to get this into tissues. And the key thing to understand, you probably all learned in high school. Like dissolves like. Fats like fats. Fats dislike water. They like fat. They've coated this mRNA in fat. Your cells are coated in fat. This is a mechanism of distribution that has no targeting whatsoever. That means it will...
But by design, explicitly, right? So as to protect the mRNA in the intercellular space from the mRNAses long enough for it to get into cells.
Well, it's not just to protect it. And in fact, it probably doesn't even need protection because it's so pseudouridine stabilized that the mRNA aces aren't going to take it apart. But the idea is, just as soap bubbles join, soap bubbles are made of the same stuff. When they touch each other, they join, and they can become, two soap bubbles can become one big soap bubble. So that's how cell membranes work too. And this is like a pseudomembrane. The lipid nanoparticle is functioning like a pseudomembrane, and it bumps up against a cell, and then it spills its contents into the cell. But the point is, it doesn't choose what cell it's going into, unlike any virus. So, to the extent that you might make the argument that this is doing the same thing as an attenuated virus vaccine, the attenuated virus vaccine is inherently self-limiting in terms of what tissues it will attack.
Just note that we were talking about 1, 2, and 3 ways that this is not just like taking stuff in that's identical to what's in your body. And your third item on that list, I was saying, sounds very much like what traditional vaccines do. But the rejoinder that you make is the critical one. And yes, we have talked about that here before, which is that an attenuated virus vaccine actually has an organism or a virus that exists in nature, and that has some experience with you as a host, not you an individual, but you the species. If it didn't, then you would not be getting vaccinated against this thing. And so it will go after particular tissues, not be indiscriminate. Whereas a nanolipid covered piece of mRNA has no evolutionary history in a human host at all, and therefore will be indiscriminate in what cells it attaches itself to.
Yes, and the other traditional kind of vaccine that is now used, where fragments of a pathogen are introduced in order to induce an immune response, that doesn't enter cells at all. And so that is not causing your immune system to target your own cells. It doesn't do this in any way. So in any case, what he's saying is pure nonsense at multiple levels. This is not a natural thing that you should feel like, oh, I'm really, it's a little bit like saying GMOs, we've been genetically modifying organisms for 1,000 years, so relax, right? For thousands of years. So relax. And the answer is no, actually you've genetically modified that organism so you can dump a bunch of pesticide on it. How good is that pesticide for me? Right? Should I be worried about GMOs? Yes, I should be, for multiple reasons, including that one.
But selective breeding.
Right.
Not the same thing.
Right. It's sleight of hand.
Yeah.
It's logical sleight of hand designed to fool people who don't know a lot. And not knowing a lot isn't the fault of anybody. It's just you didn't study this thing enough to spot their lies. But those of us who did, this is a really weird thing for somebody who just got a Nobel Prize to be saying about their own invention, because he's got to know it's wrong.
But again, this is him talking 2.5 years ago.
True, but he sure as hell knew
Yes.
that this wasn't just mRNA like the stuff floating around in your body, because he's the world's expert in modifying mRNA to stabilize it.
And put it into people's bodies.
Right. I mean, come on. Okay, so just a couple more points. He says that this is degraded within a couple days or at most a week. Well, let's put it this way. If that was comforting in 2021, if you really believe that in 2021, then he ought to be alarmed in 2023, because we now know it doesn't limit itself, that it's there for months. So why is he not now sounding the alarm? If that was comforting then, he ought to be alarmed now, and he doesn't appear to be. He then says, well, there are 4 types of fats, and 2 of them are natural, so don't worry. Well, I would love to...
In the nanolipid.
And the lipid nanoparticles. Yeah. And then he says the 2 that aren't natural, they're there at very low levels. What does very low levels mean? Is this the same very low levels of the assurances that the mercury in the vaccine that you want me to inject into my kid isn't a problem? Is it that kind of low levels, right? Like, what does low levels even mean? And then he says, and it's gone within 24 to 48 hours because the body degrades it. Now, wait a second. Are you telling me that you've just introduced a novel lipid that doesn't exist in my body, but my body's expert at disassembling it? I want to check that. Maybe that's true, but that is not a slam dunk. And the fact that you can't find it doesn't mean it isn't there, especially if you're not looking very hard. So he says nothing of the vaccine is left after days or a week, which again, if that was comforting in 2021, it ought to be alarming now. And he says the mRNA does not integrate into the DNA, which again might be true, but he says it does nothing to the DNA. Again, maybe that was believed then, but we now know that there's lots of DNA contaminating these vaccines, that it is getting into people, and it appears to be integrating into their nuclear genomes.
Well, that's a different response, though. I'm seeing your notes rather than remembering what he said.
Yep.
That these mRNA, like the mRNA vaccine does nothing to the DNA, is not a response to these mRNA vaccines are contaminated with DNA.
I agree, but again, I'm not arguing that from his perspective in 2021 that he necessarily knew how these things were going to be produced or that there was going to be contamination. Maybe he did, given what he's willing to say about the naturalness of the mRNAs, which he knows aren't natural. I wouldn't put it past him. But even if he was naive then, we should be seeing a different thing unfold now. We should not be seeing a Nobel Prize be awarded by people who say that there isn't an adverse event signal. Really? This is just pure theater. Yeah. You've got the most prestigious prize in the world being awarded by people who can't even avoid saying obviously wrong things in a press conference. They can't, there's not enough vagueness in the world for them to avoid absolute lies in their press conference. That's stunning. They would give a prize that can't be defended without having to lie? Oh, okay. Well, I guess that's where we are. But the final thing I will say is that I believe we knew that the Nobel process was corrupt. Many people have, in the aftermath of this, pointed out Obama's Peace Prize, which is ironic, was given to him before he had the chance to do such terrible things, and then history reflects very poorly on that choice. This is not the only place. These prizes are really quite a political phenomenon. But the degree to which pharma capture and whatever travels with it has obviously completely owned this process and is now delivering prizes for design defects in products that it wishes to expand the market for. Mm-hmm. That's pretty amazing. And what dawned on me in reflecting on this was we are now living in an era in which it is literally true that anything plugged into a major institution is compromised. Anything scientific that is plugged into a major institution is compromised, which does not mean that there is no science. There's lots of science, but the only science that is in any way trustworthy is ragtag fugitive science, right? You've got people who still know how to do science existing outside of the institutions, right? You've got, a band of rebels who insist on still doing the job, even though pharma and its cronies have attempted to stamp it out everywhere that it's supposed to be done. That's a strange era to be living in. But at least if you start with that premise, you will not be so confused by all of the garbage that is emerging from all of the places that at one time might have been trusted to tell you what was going on.